Good morning. I'm Stuart Lander. I'm delighted to have on stage with us Michael Eisenberg, who many of you will know as the co-founder of Aleph, one of Israel's most successful venture capital firms. As you all know, Israel's had a massive impact on global innovation over the last few decades, and few people have had a front row seat on it as Michael has. And we're going to talk about that evolution, and we're going to talk a little bit about the changing landscape in the Middle East. So welcome, Michael. To get going, I'd love you to give some background on Aleph. You were a partner at Benchmark at a transformative time in Israeli tech, Waze, Wix, an incredible amount of capital coming to the country from overseas. You co-founded it in 2013. Why was that the right time to start Aleph? What was the strategy and how's that evolved over time?
First of all, thank you for having me. Thanks to you and to Mark. Vinod is a tough act to follow, to say the least. Why did we start Aleph in 2013? Well, sir, I was a partner at Benchmark before that. And actually, Horsley Bridge came to me and said, nobody's raised a Series A fund in Israel for a very long time. You can go raise one. Why don't you do it? And the basic strategy was to create a firm that would service the hell out of entrepreneurs. It was modeled on Benchmark. It's an equal partner only fund. They'd be small funds that would focus on DPI and carry rather than these very large funds that focus on management fee. But what we saw in Israel at the time was people had stopped wanting to sell their companies early to the likes of Intel and Cisco and Microsoft, and were kind of ready for bear. When I was involved in Wix, I was in the early investors in Wix. You saw this ambition that other than, for example, Gil Shwed at Checkpoint before that, you hadn't seen. And all these people were spinning out of Wix and Scioto and Checkpoint and many other places and say, okay, I'm ready for bear now. I'm willing to build a generational company. And the venture infrastructure didn't exist to do that. And so that's what we built Aleph, again, modeled on Benchmark, to really service these Israeli entrepreneurs to build very large and meaningful global companies and brands out of Israel.
And maybe talk about some of the companies that you've invested in that have been successful.
So yesterday, Lemonade reported earnings. Stock didn't perform terribly well, but the company is on a clip. It's the fastest growing insurance company in the world. Melio, which is the leader in B2B payments right now, a company called Next Silicon, which probably most people have not heard of, but is one of the leaders in the future of semiconductors right now. Nexar, which has the largest data set in the world for road and driving data after Tesla. I keep going. Keep going. Empathy.com, which is...
Maybe let's focus a little bit on the success that the Israeli ecosystems had. I think there are more startups per capita in Israel than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, all that shows that nobody wants to work for another boss in Israel.
There are, I think I have this right, after the US and China and maybe Canada, there are more Israeli companies on the NASDAQ than any other country in the world. This is a country of 10 million people. They've had an outsized impact on global tech. I think there are many people in this room right now that are from communities and countries that really look to replicate the success that Israel's had. What is the secret sauce? Why are Israeli startups so successful?
Some number of years ago, I gave a talk at Harvard, and some woman from New Zealand got up and said, how do we replicate Startup Nation in Israel, in New Zealand, sorry. To which I responded to her, well, I actually don't think you can, and I'll try to explain why. If you're a parent to a kindergartner in Israel, and the kindergarten is supposed to open at 7:30, you turn up at 7:30, there's nobody there. And then the parents start to kind of arrange on the spot who's responsible for this. And, there may have supposed to have been a bus there and the bus doesn't come on time, and there's supposed to be computers and they're not there and people are donating their computers. And the secret to Israel is that a lot of things that you'd think work normally in most other places actually don't work in Israel. And we've been way ahead of the rest of the world on government incompetence. And yeah, it turns out to be catchy around the world. But what Israel does have is civilians who take responsibility. And civilians are the most, I'll argue, the most capable civilians in civic society on the planet. Because when you get to that kindergarten, the parents are in charge. And by the way, and then the 6-year-olds are in charge. And because kids go to the Army at age 18, they have responsibility both for weapons and for fellow soldiers at a super young age. And that develops a large amount of agency. Many of you probably saw Naval Ravikant say the most important thing today is not intelligence, but agency. Israelis have agency in spades. And so I don't think it's terribly replicable. In addition to which, the Army, because it entrusts these kids at age 18, 19, and 20, both with budgets and with super advanced technology in this kind of cauldron, forces these kids to be super innovative. And this kind of combination of agency, things not working so civilians have to take responsibility, and this kind of battle testing, where, by the way, your technology matters for life and death, not for money, pushes kids to the edge and enables them to become, I think, super entrepreneurs at a relatively young age. The government got involved in the beginning of my career in 1991, 92, by jump-starting the startup industry, but then they've made the most enlightened decision ever of any government. They got out of the way. And that's been super helpful too.
And so the IDF is obviously a really critical component of the society and the psyche of entrepreneurs. How important is immigration as well? Because immigration is hotly debated around the world. Israel is an example, I think, of immigration really being successful and helping the business world. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Without getting into the politics of immigration here or in the UK or in Germany or in France or in Austria or wherever else you want to pick, Israel's unique in this way for a few reasons. One is it's mostly, but not all, Jewish immigration. There is a number, not a small number at this point, by the way, of Eritreans and Sudanese who have immigrated as well. But it tends to bring a high level of talent. But most importantly, I think what's gone wrong in many countries with immigration is the immigrants have not been inculcated with the values of the country. And what mandatory military service does is it ensures that people go through a socialization with the core values of the country, and that creates a more unified society. There is diversity in where people come from, which is what makes it super interesting. We've had a large amount of French immigration recently. The food has gotten better, and the technology has gotten better at the same time. But there's a socialization that people go through that introduces them to Israeli society, and by Gen Point 5, people are well socialized, and I think that's an important thing. I've said this openly, written it publicly. I think mandatory military service is a good thing, not a bad thing. And I've encouraged a number of American politicians to do it also. I think it matters.
So with all the success of Israeli startups, I feel like the country still hasn't produced a homegrown winner to the scale of a Google, an Amazon, a Stripe. Why is that, and what's needed to take that next step?
So when I got started in venture, Israeli companies were selling for $100 to $200 million. When I started Aleph, we had our first multi-billion-dollar companies. At the beginning of my career, they said, why is there no Nokia? Nokia sneezed and Finland had a cold. And what happens is the goalposts keep moving. And so we have not had a Stripe or an OpenAI, but now we're at the level they used to ask me a decade ago when I started Aleph, why are you not there? I think there's two reasons. Technology industry started in Silicon Valley in the United States in the 50s and 60s, got started in Israel in the 90s, 30 years behind. And I think these cycles matter, actually, in order to build talent. I think that's one reason. Reason two, it's only 10 million people. It's actually hard to scale people. One of my great hopes about AI is it makes our population disadvantage become a population advantage over time. And you can build a $100 billion company with a lot fewer people than you needed before. But I think it's actually happening. We're just 30 years behind the United States. And I think we're lapping Europe. We don't talk about this a lot because Israel often gets lumped in with Europe. But Europe's in real trouble. I was in the UAE a few times over the last year, and the statistic I keep hearing is 9,000, I know you're from London, 9,000 British multimillionaires have moved to the UAE. And when I was there 3 weeks ago, meeting with senior political people, they say that entrepreneurs are leaving London in spades.
To be fair, it helps when there's no tax.
It matters. There's a lot of tax in Israel, but people come. And so I think we're getting there, and we will lap Europe, and we'll have a $100 billion company, my guess is within a decade.
So I want to shift slightly. I can't speak to you without talking about the tough neighborhood that you live in. For the last 16 or 17 months, Israel's been fighting not a one-front war, but a seven-front war. October the 7th and the hostage crisis has had a devastating impact on the country, as it would any country. What did you think the impact was going to be in those days after October the 7th on startups, on capital, and what's the reality been 16 months later?
So the first thing is, this is a very hard day. For those of you who didn't see, the Bibas family was buried today after coming out of 500 plus days of captivity. These two young boys were mutilated in captivity, and Shiri Bibas, the mother, was taken. And I watched the eulogy that her husband and the father of these two children gave today. It was beyond heartbreaking. And so it has been a rough 15 months, and it's not over. And it's not over, I think, on two fronts. It's not over because many of the hostages are still being held by Hamas. And two, Hamas is still fundamentally in power in Gaza. And that needs to end. And Iran still is surging forward to a nuclear weapon, which President Biden and now President Trump have both correctly said is not okay. You know, I spent nights in a safe room, you know, when there were 300 missiles coming over from Iran, ballistic missiles that take 12 minutes or 8 minutes to arrive. You know, no other country's gone through that. And so it's been rough. And at the same time, it's been incredibly inspiring. The level of resilience in the country is stunning. You know, our startups lost almost across the board 15 to 20% of their employees to reserve duty in the military. Nobody missed a beat. You know, people hit numbers, people hit delivery deadlines. I heard from Alex Karp and Jensen. Nobody missed a beat. Everyone delivered on time what they were supposed to deliver. In my own family, I had 4 kids in Gaza for months, many months. And so everybody's family was disrupted. But what did I think? So in November, I wrote a piece that went fairly viral on Twitter that this is the defining generation, not just for Israel, but for the world. These kids gone out to fight for what mattered, and they would come back and build defining companies. 15 months later, we see these kids starting companies, these young people starting companies. And they are unbelievable in their ambition. Something happened to them in this cauldron of the last 15 months that has raised their ambition level and their innovation level beyond anything we've seen before. The second thing is, I think everyone wrote these kids off. It was the TikTok generation, it was the Instagram generation. It turns out to be the Insta-hero generation. And they got from behind their screens, they went to battle, but they didn't miss a beat. Like, they came back on the innovator. I remember about a month and a half into the war, I turned up at 8,200 for something, and there were like mattresses everywhere. It was the greatest hackathon in history. People of all ages had come back, and there's this multi-generational hackathon doing things to save lives, find hostages, and help out. And so we are seeing just incredible innovation. And by the way, had I told you on October the 8th, where I would argue that the portfolio called Israel was notionally down 80%, that we'd have a record year in M&A, 10 billion, right? NVIDIA bought 2 companies, Salesforce bought 2 companies, and many other. A record year in investment, you would have laughed. But that's what happened. And by the way, Accel opened an office this year, Sequoia opened an office this year, Index opened an office this year. We invested more money in startups this year than we did in the 2.5 previous years, in the last 15 months. Like, people are standing up. And I think, you know, patriotism matters, rallying around the flag matters, and people just want to build for the betterment of society and the world, and it has been absolutely inspiring. This is the greatest, most defining generation of kids I think there has been in the world in 80 years.
That's amazing to hear.
Yeah.
That's amazing to hear.
And my grandfather, boy, fought in the U.S. Navy in World War II all around the Pacific for 3 years. I think about him a lot in this context. That was an incredible generation of Americans, and this is for the world, and this is an incredible generation of Israeli kids for the world.
You know, I read that last year, Israeli startups raised $11 billion. That was 31% more than 2023, which was 9 months before October the 7th. I think there's a lot of people in this room that would love to, and are trying to, tap into Israeli tech success. As investors, Two parts to the question. Part one, what's the most important thing they need to know about investing in Israel? Part two, what's the mistake you see time and time and time again outsiders make that they should correct?
Do your work because, this is the answer to the second question. Do your work because the great thing about Israel is there's not 6 degrees of separation, there's 1 degree of separation. Everybody knows the kindergarten teacher of somebody else. So if you turn up on the ground, you can find your way around the country incredibly fast. So you need to do that and always just ask. There's no such thing as being politically incorrect in Israel, or you just be direct and ask the question. I think the broader comment on your first question is the following. I think it's not a secret. About 3 years ago, the world started to change a lot. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the beginning of AI. We are in a chaotic period that happens, I think, once every 80 years or so in the world. If you go back, the 1940s, the 1860s, et cetera. And we're in one of these chaotic periods. In a recent book that I wrote, I described like 4 revolutions going on right now. There's a geopolitical realignment. Like I said before, democratic governments are failing. There's no leadership around. Some of that has to do with demography. Some of that has to do with just fecklessness, and maybe some has to do with social media or being followers. The third revolution is like the collapse of the welfare state. And then the fourth one is AI, which, as Vinod said a second ago, is going to be more transformative than anything we had. One thing I'll say about Israel, and this relates to the opportunity, is since October 7th, many wartime CEOs have emerged. But not only since October 7th, Israel is really good at dealing with chaos. Like I said before, our government is not particularly capable, like I think many democratic governments around the world, but we have is these incredibly responsible civilians. And so I think the rest of the world is going to look more like Israel over the next decade. There's going to be so much change. It's going to be accelerated. In Israel, it's like a fast-paced life, incredibly. I grew up in Manhattan, which I thought was fast-paced. Israel is like nonstop. It's nonstop. Something's happening all the time. And so Israel is a microcosm, in my view, of where the world is going over the next 5 to 7 years. And so getting in on the ground to invest in Israel now with these wartime CEOs who are used to chaos, who have an incredible agency, is actually a good window into how you'll need to invest in this world that's going through accelerated change right now.
So let's take that one step further. In September 2020, the diplomatic map of the Middle East was redrawn with the Abraham Accords. First with the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco. How has that impacted? I mean, you're sitting in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. How has that really impacted Israeli tech and financial markets, the UAE in particular?
One general comment before I move on to that is I was sitting with somebody yesterday and we were talking about what are the causes for the increases of multiples. I was in San Francisco yesterday. I think one of them is the sovereign wealth funds taking more of their money out of Europe, places like that, and putting it in the US. That has not fully happened in Israel yet, but there is what I would call nibbling by the UAE in particular, and even kind of funds where the Saudis are invested that are investing in Israel. But I was last week in the UAE, which is like, I don't know, my 15th or 16th trip since the Abraham Accords. I was on, Secretary Mnuchin took a group of 14 Israeli business people right after the Abraham Accords were signed in the middle of COVID. It was kind of this funny social distancing thing to the UAE. First of all, I'd just say it's a remarkable country that's incredibly well run, with incredibly warm and welcoming people. I was there last week at a conference in the desert, and the warmth is real. And so I think the first thing is, if you live in Israel and all of a sudden you have this regional partner that's warm, and when I spoke at that first event with Secretary Mnuchin, I said it's like a gathering of long-lost cousins. I think that warmth and that family feeling matters. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it takes time to build relationships and for the investments to flow, but they're starting. We don't really disclose our LPs, but the Wall Street Journal reported that one of the UAE sovereign wealth funds put a small amount of money in our fund about 2.5 years ago. And that's become an incredibly warm relationship and one that I value a lot. The most important thing, I'd argue, is the open dialogue that exists in the exchange of ideas. The fact that I was able to be in the UAE last week with people from Qatar and Kuwait and Saudi and the UAE, and by the way, in China and Hong Kong and Russia and Jordan in the room, that exchange of ideas and dialogue matters for regional investment and matters for peace. And I think with President Trump declaring, and President Biden before that, the IMEC corridor, right, which is this route that will go from India via the GCC to through Israel and out to Europe, this is going to be a big deal. I don't think people fully understand what the impact this is going to have on supply chains, on the cost of energy, on development. It's going to be a big deal, and I think it matters.
I was in the Middle East a couple of months ago, and I went for the first time to Riyadh. And I found it exactly as you described the UAE. Incredibly warm, incredibly friendly. You can feel the change in the air. You can feel the ambition. There's been a lot of talk about Saudi normalization with Israel. How important is that? How big a deal will that be?
It will be absolutely transformative. I think the talk is ahead of what will happen. This is all takes time. And, the Middle East, things take a lot of time. The Abraham Accords was a baby born overnight, but it didn't happen overnight, right? The world saw it overnight, but it had been going on for a long time. And things take time in the Middle East, and they should, by the way, after all these years. But it is a big deal on a number of accords. Number one is they are the protector of the Muslim holy sites. And the Hajj happens in Saudi Arabia. So they're viewed as the keeper of the holy places, which gives, like pardon the pun, the kosher symbol to any other Muslim country like Indonesia to share with Israel. By the way, quietly, I've run into a bunch of Indonesians in Israel over the last 36 months. So I think that's already going on. But I think more of it will happen going forward, particularly as Saudi joins whatever accords they are, whether the Abraham Accords or others. But I'll make a more radical comment related to our business, which is the public markets, which should be open, and so few entrepreneurs are going public today, which is a whole different discussion. How did venture capitalists get to DPI? We all need to be DPI focused in this day and age where you can't go public without $300 million of revenue, which is ridiculous. But I think we'll see within a decade Israeli tech companies going public on some combination of the UAE exchange, the Saudi stock exchange, and the Israeli stock exchange before they end up on NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange. Because the US regulations have raised the bar so much and the cost so much to go public in the US, we need an alternative. There's a couple of very well-performing companies on the ASX in Australia, and there's a lot of liquidity in Saudi and the UAE, a lot. And there's been a small number of tech companies go public there. And I really, really believe we'll see Israeli tech companies public on these exchanges within a decade.
Which really challenges Europe moving forward to its, what you talked a little bit about Europe being in chaos.
I'm super bearish on Europe in general, and I think it does challenge Europe a lot. And I think we'll see a transformed region. Look, had you told anyone on October 8th that we'd be sitting here, whatever today is, February 26th, I think, and Hezbollah would be decimated, Hamas is decimated, Iranian has been stripped of their air defense, and people are talking about normalization still with Saudi Arabia. The Abraham Accords stayed intact with the UAE, and money and businesses flowing back and forth. They would have thought you were crazy, but he stood in there. And by the way, a huge amount of credit goes to His Highness, the ruler of the UAE, MBZ. He's just done an incredible job and an incredible leader, and he's worthy of all the commendation in the world.
Okay, so we're nearly out of time. But I want to finish on something just looking to the future. Israel probably is mostly known in tech for its strength in cyber. Fast forward 5 to 10 years from now, what are the trends that you're seeing in Israel that are going to make Israel a leader in a particular category or categories in the future?
Look, cyber was to be expected because that's what the military does, right? The war in particular, but it started before this, has just been accelerated, has brought a few things to the front, by the way, both in the US and in Israel. And I think that's what we'll see. The first is a secure supply chain for AI, right? There's a big, those reading the news today, if you read Bloomberg this morning about Trump kind of doubling down on the Biden administration restrictions and what this means for semiconductor capital equipment companies, Tokyo Electron, ASML, et cetera. Israel, by the way, is one of six in the world, that has the whole stack. Semiconductor design, for those who don't know, it's a lot of Apple semiconductor design, NVIDIA semiconductor design, other semiconductor design happens in Israel. Semiconductor capital equipment, we have numerous semiconductor capital equipment companies, and the software stack for AI. And so, number one, I think we'll see a big push into that entire stack for a secure and leveraged supply chain for AI, semiconductors, capital equipment, et cetera. That's number one. Number two is material science meets AI, specifically around energy, biology, or the physical sciences, and chemistry. I think We're seeing a lot more companies in those areas. That'll be a second one. And the third one, at Aleph, we made a decision 3 years ago that we don't do foundation models. We were helped by the fact there's only one in Israel. But this kind of fast leveraging of AI to do hard things. I think there's an interesting trade-off in the AI application market today between the super fast growth you're seeing and what's a real moat. What the Israelis are doing now, the Israeli entrepreneurs we see, they're going for the moat, not the fast growth right now. They're doing super hard things. So they came out of the war and what they did in the military and said, okay, we can do super hard things with this. And so I think you'll see these kind of much deeper technological implementations of AI rolled out into the physical world that'll come out of Israel. So that's something we're super excited about. And I think the last one you're going to be surprised about is fintech turns to kind of next-gen financial services, and that Israel will be, much like the UAE started to become what they call a capital of capital, Israel will become another center for finance and capitalism over the next decade.
Well, Michael, we're willing the success of Israel and the startups in the future, and thank you for coming all the way to be with us today.
Thank you.